In this video, I'm going to cover some basic anatomical terminology and the major regions of the brain. We'll go into more detail in class, and of course, this is a very introductory level video. The brain is an incredibly complex organ, and so we have to be very careful about oversimplifying its function. The first thing we should do is just talk a little bit about the skull. Contrary to what you might think, the skull is actually made up of several different bones that have fused together. These plates roughly match up to the lobes of the brain that we will identify later. What's useful here is for us to use the skull to identify anatomical direction. Remember, in scientific inquiry, specificity of language is important. We have to avoid terms like front and back, top and bottom, or on the side, as those can mean different things in different animals. For example, is a horse's spine on top or in back? So we use anterior to the front and posterior to the back instead. Superior, meaning above, and inferior, meaning below, are more useful terms than just above and below because they can be used to describe relative location. The thalamus is superior to the midbrain, for example. Similarly, we describe structures as lateral to, meaning outwards from the center line of the body, or medial to, meaning inwards towards the center line. Another important term is the rostrocaudal axis. This is the line from nose to tail. In most animals, it's a straight line. Think about a fish or a horse or a dog. In humans, due to our erect posture, it is a line that curves at the very top of the spine. So if we think about how the brain sits within the cranium, we can identify four major lobes or regions of the brain: the very large frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. These lobes are named after the skull plates that they sit beneath. Please keep in mind that while the structures within the lobes share some common functions, the lobes themselves do not do anything. These are just geographical terms that help us to identify the location and function of structures like the motor cortex. You may already know the brain is also separated into two hemispheres. This is a superior view of the brain where we can see the left and the right hemispheres from above. This means that you have a left frontal and a right frontal lobe, a left temporal and a left temporal lobe, and so on. Again, while there is some hemispheric specialization, both halves of the brain work in concert to carry out the shared functions of the entire system. Later, we'll look at what happens when communication between the hemispheres is cut. We can further break down the brain into more functional regions. Let's start with the area that is the oldest in evolutionary terms and the most caudal along that rostrocaudal axis. This is the hindbrain, which is responsible for the most basic physiological functions. In this region, we have three major structures: the medulla, which is the most inferior portion of the brainstem and controls autonomic respiration and heartbeat; the pons, which is superior to the medulla and controls autonomic sleep and arousal states. There's also the cerebellum, which literally means little brain. It controls balance and coordination, but has also recently been implicated in more complex functions and may play a role in autism. As we move up the rostrocaudal axis, we enter the midbrain region. This is a tricky area as its boundaries are not always clearly defined. The substantia nigra is a group of dark gray colored neural networks that is important in smoothing out motor functions. It has been implicated in the motor dysfunction associated with Parkinson's disease. The reticular formation is considered an antiquated and obsolete classification, though it is still required content for graduate students studying physiological psychology. The reticular formation passes through the length of the center of the brainstem and ends in the midbrain. It has many functions, but one of the most important is to serve as a kind of gatekeeper for incoming stimulus. We call this a go-no-go function in that the reticular formation allows some peripheral nervous system messages to go through to the cerebral cortex and therefore conscious awareness, but not others. For example, You may not be consciously aware of the sound of the air conditioning or the heating until I mentioned it. By drawing your attention to that stimulus, the reticular formation switches from a no-go to a go for that background stimulus. Finally, there is the midbrain proper, which is important in triggering reactions to auditory and visual stimuli. It is because of this area that you flinch when something comes flying towards you, especially in your peripheral vision, or you jump when you hear a loud noise. Moving further along the axis, we reach the forebrain. As you can see, as we progress along the rostrocaudal axis, functional areas become more complex. This is due to evolutionary pressures that have forced the development of these regions over a very long period of time. One key structure is the thalamus, which acts as a relay station, sending incoming information from the peripheral system to the appropriate areas of the cortex. Though many experts consider the classification limbic system obsolete, it is still a highly utilized term. There is considerable disagreement about which brain components it includes, but it's generally accepted that in addition to the amygdala and the hippocampus, it includes the hypothalamus and the septum. These structures influence your emotional state and your memory functions. For example, the hippocampus is responsible for creating new memories and facilitating memory recall, though not memory storage. It also helps you create a spatial map or memory-based awareness of where things are in relation to your body. The amygdala is a very sensitive structure that receives visual and auditory input. It helps you to identify dangerous things, for example, snakes and spiders, but it also draws your attention to a dangerous face in a crowd. Other structures of the forebrain include the basal ganglia, which is a multi-component system mostly residing at the base of the cerebral cortex. It is intimately connected to all kinds of smaller components such as the subthalamic nucleus, the diencephalon, and the substantia nigra in the midbrain. By receiving messages from the motor cortex and passing them along to the substantia nigra, cerebellum, and eventually the peripheral motor system, it coordinates motor commands. The all-important hypothalamus is a very small area anterior and inferior to the thalamus. It controls any physiological function that is related to hormones. For example, eating, drinking, sexual arousal, but also things like fatigue, stress, and even body temperature. The hypothalamus is incredibly small and complex. It is the reason you often feel hungry when you are tired. The cerebral cortex is the newest part of the brain in evolutionary terms. It is all the pink wrinkly stuff. Once again, we can organize the cortex into regions called lobes. Various functions occur in each region, and again, these functions follow that predictable path of development from the most primitive and basic to more and more complex. Vision occurs in the occipital lobe in the very posterior area of the brain. Touch sense occurs in the parietal lobe, while hearing is a temporal lobe function. Finally, the most complex functions, such as personality, language production, planning, and judgment, occur in the frontal lobe. As I mentioned previously, the lobes themselves don't do anything. Rather, there are structures within them, such as the visual cortex and auditory cortex, that actually carry out functions. Everything in the brain is contralateral. That is, the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, and so on. If these two hemispheres could not communicate, then a blind person would have a hard time clapping because the left hand would literally not know where the right hand is. Thankfully, we have a very large bundle of neural fibers called the corpus callosum, literally meaning tough body, that links the two hemispheres together. Information from one side travels to the other side, notifying the left hand about what the right hand is doing. I also feel that it is necessary to debunk the myth that people are either right-brained or left-brained. While there is a considerable amount of hemispheric specialization, one hemisphere is not particularly dominant over the other, and we have to be very careful about oversimplifying the shared functions of the two. One function that is highly lateralized is language. Broca's area, which is responsible for language production, and Wernicke's area, which is responsible for language comprehension, are present in the left hemisphere for about 90% of all people. Okay, so that was a pretty quick overview of the major areas of the brain. As I mentioned, we will go into more detail in class.